Ma avete tenuto il posto?
Ah, com'è terribile sapere, quando il sapere non serve proprio a nulla, chissà. E io sapevo, ma ho preferito dimenticare, perché altrimenti non mi sarei lasciato condurre qui.
Che succede? Cos'è questo tuo spavento?
Lasciami tornare a casa, Edipo. Te ne prego, dammi ascolto. Così sarà minore il peso per tutti e due.
No! Parlare è il tuo dovere verso la città.
Le tue parole non sono utili neanche a te.
Rimani in nome di Dio, tu sai. Te ne preghiamo tutti, i miei cittadini e io.
Voi non siete che dei pazzi. Ma io non parlerò, non li voglio svelare, i tuoi mali.
Tu sai e taci. Vuoi tradirci, vuoi perdere la città, ma sei fatto di sasso.
Tu mi rinfacci e mi rimproveri la mia natura. E non vuoi conoscere la natura che è in te.
Chi non si avirerebbe ascoltando parole che suonano offesa al re e alla città?
Ah, i fatti parleranno, anche se io non dirò niente.
Ma è proprio per questo che tu devi parlare.
Io ho parlato anche troppo. E tu arrabbiati pure quanto vuoi.
Ah sì? Ebbene allora sappi quello che mi viene in mente. Io penso che il delitto l'hai ordito tu. E se tu non fossi cieco, direi che l'hai compiuto tu stesso, con le tue mani.
Ah, è questo che tu pensi. Allora io dico, obbedisci al bando che tu stesso hai promulgato e guardati da questo momento stesso di stare qui in mezzo a noi, perché sei tu il colpevole che contamina la nostra terra. E se non hai ben capito, te lo ripeto, tu sei l'assassino che stai cercando. E non sai di avere un rapporto infame con le persone che ti sono più care. E non vuoi vedere il male che è in te.
E credi che io ti lasci uscire illeso da queste tue parole?
Io sono già in salvo, perché ho dalla parte mia la verità.
La verità per ogni altro, ma non per te, che hai ciechi gli occhi, le orecchie e anche la mente.
Oh, infelice, tu mi insulti, come tutti fra non molto insulteranno te.
Dì, a chi le debbo tutte queste tue belle invenzioni? A te o a Creonte? Ricchezza, potenza, grandezza, quanta invidia suscitate in questa vita umana che è una sola lotta. È così, per colpa del potere che io ebbi in dono sulla città, potere che io non ho chiesto. Anche il fedele Creonte, il buon amico dei primi tempi, ora mi vuole rovesciare. Creonte, sì, certo, e prendere il mio posto, mandando avanti questo vecchio mago, questo mendicante che sa vedere solo quando si tratta di guadagnare. Ed è sempre cieco nella sua arte.
Anche se tu sei il re, io posso risponderti con la stessa tua franchezza, se lo voglio. Che io non dipendo da te, ma da Dio. E poiché hai voluto davanti a tutti e al cospetto di Dio schernire la mia cecità e la mia vecchiaia, ecco ciò che ti dico. Tu guardi e non vedi tutta la vergogna e il male in cui ti trovi. Sai chi ti ha dato la vita, sai che i tuoi morti e viventi ti maledicono, e un giorno vedrai solo oscurità, e quanto griderai allora, il giorno in cui finalmente capirai come e con chi ti sei sposato, figlio della fortuna.
è l'odio degli uomini. Questo è l'amore. Questa è la paura. Questa è la rabbia. Il seme dell'odio. La necessità di sbranarsi per sopravvivere.
Ti sto dicendo di andare a chiamare un dottore!
Odio, amore, paura, rabbia. Eterni sentimenti anche nell'agghiacciante ordine di una mostruosa società di là da venire. I morti sono un simbolo. Simbolo di ordine esterno in un caos interno allucinante. E questi i vivi, figure irreali e fantastiche, pronte a divorare i propri simili per sistema.
L'ordine è ristabilito. L'hai trovato almeno il corpo?
È davanti a un bar. Ci passano sopra tutti. Voglio portarlo via di lì subito.
I morti nella strada servono come esempio, per evitarne altri. Non si devono toccare.
Siete un branco di assassini.
È questa la grottesca società dei cannibali.
Attenzione, ascoltatemi, vi stanno castrando. In nome del padre, del figlio, datevi la gamba. In nome del padre, del figlio, reagite subito.
Per lui, l'uomo venuto dal nulla, essere umano sgombro dal terrore di inibizioni, c'è uno sconcertante muro di angoscia avanti. È l'uomo, ma viene considerato scimmia.
Lo hanno catturato alcuni nostri colleghi della televisione, riuscendo a battere sul tempo la polizia. Ecco, Mowgli scappa di nuovo. L'uomo è stato visto insieme ad Antigone, la ragazza che ha osato rubare i corpi al popolo.
Do you speak English? Français? Deutsch?
Gamin Jackson.
Per lei, la donna di sempre, libera dalla corazza dell'egoismo, c'è un baratro avanti che la trascina senza respiro in una pazzesca avventura.
Che cos'hai? Perché non puoi?
Insomma, perché ho l'uniforme, ecco.
Dai, te la puoi togliere, dai.
Ho fatto il voto.
Un voto?
Sì, il voto militare, 2 giorni fa.
Può il sistema pianificare i sentimenti?
Trucco? No, bot.
Può ridurre l'uomo a robot? Può distruggere la fede? Può annullare l'amore e la vita stessa?
Good evening. So, let's start with a couple of introductions. I know you must be a little bit overwhelmed that this film was only 5 years old, 50 years old. But we decided to use it to introduce this conference. So, the Vice President of the Italian Constitutional Court, Marta Cartabia. The President Emeritus of the Italian Chamber of Deputies, Luciano Violante. I will call him Professor, even though he is not a professor, Massimo Bernardini. we have shown you a scene of Oedipus the king and the original trailer of the cannibals that were in the Italian history of cinema are obviously very different movies. Naturally, the author from which both of these movies stem which are both obviously very different films, they both stem from Sophocles. He was co-protagonist of the political scene of Athens at the time, as well as author of tragedies. He had public office. He also participated in the Athenian Wars. So he was very involved in the current affairs of his time. 25 centuries ago. Apparently, he wrote 123 plays, even though very few have survived, and they continue to be current today. I would like to explain in a couple of words what these two tragedies, how these two tragedies are at the center of our culture. 1977, Oedipus is the inspiration for Franco Parenti, Testori, Italian writers. This year, Oedipus is also the subject of an orchestral work by Cosmi. And in Salzburg, we have Oedipe by Emesco. In December, Fura del Baus, another theatrical production, very original, will have Oedipus as its inspiration for a work in Amsterdam. We also have Oedipus Rex by Bob Wilson. And Tuminas, a director, will also direct, as a director, will bring this work to the stage. In Edinburgh, Robert Tyke rewrote Oedipus, and if you like, in October, at the Mariinsky Ballet, we have Gergiev, the Oedipus Rex of Stravinsky of 1927, and rewritten in French by Jacques Cocteau. For example, Cocteau, in between 1924 and 27, he wrote another work that was inspired by the Oedipus trilogy and Picasso and Coco Chanel. In 1948, Tiresias, the character of Tiresias, is Julian Beck of the Living Theatre, who in 1967, who puts a new version of Antigone by Brecht on the stage. Another one from the Franco era Spanish cultural scene in the 50s. Until today, in 2018, Mezzi, who has another production here in Italy, in the following year, 2019, in Bergamo. We also have another one in Catania, and the Piccolo Teatro in Milan. Even in the jail for minors, Beccaria. Antigone Ferguson arrived on the scene in New York, and Chris North from Seconds and the City, David Stridham, Amy Ryan played the main parts. Ferguson is a place near St. Louis where a black boy was killed by the police. And these actors from American series, as interpreters of this tragedy, was a political stance, a political message. So Antigone, these characters are at the center of our culture, at the center of our Western history. They are archetypes that continue to haunt us. And they are very close to us. And sometimes we adapt them. We have even manipulated them. And we have to try and really understand, to go back to those 25 centuries ago and understand what they are about. And here, at the center of all this, we have this small book. It's called With Oedipus, Antigone, and Creon. While I was reading it, I often thought, yes, they are incorrect. The authors are not correct. The fact that they want me to present this to the meeting is a certain type of it seems overrated. They simply want me to distract me from my own job in television, and that I occupy myself with history and culture. And maybe this is what began the whole thing. And I'm certainly not an intellectual like the guests at my side. The few concepts of law that I have acquired are very few. From university, I've forgotten most of what I learned in law in university. So they didn't obviously understand that I was not the best moderator for this kind of conference. But what the object of this meeting is to go deeper into the situations of Antigone, Creon, and Oedipus, and understand how this reflects in our current situation. As I usually tend to do, I will play the part of the person who does not know much about the subject. Having said all this, I will give the floor to my co-protagonists. We have two archetypes that are two of the many archetypes in this tragedy. They will provoke us in their reading of the story. They will give us founded, reasoned motives into what appears to be the most obvious points of view, because they are the ones that are most closely linked to the common and modern mentality. Help us to present your interpretation of Antigone and the Greek tragedy. And of course, if you help us to reconstruct and maybe give us a small summary about the story, that would help us very much. Please, Professor Cartabia, I give you the floor. Thank you all for being here and to help us to reflect on these texts, which are truly eternal. I would like to begin by reassuring our moderator. He may not be an expert, but the position with which we began writing this book is exactly this position that he has right now. We are not experts on Greek civilization. We are jurists, and our field is quite another type of field. And we have been helped by a lot of experts, some of which are here, that have guided us and accompanied us. And there are many more things we could probably say. But why is it legitimate, if not interesting, for us to go back to these classics? Why are so many works, and you have named so many examples of this, why do these new works continue to spring from these originals, these classics? They are truly very few, the amount of texts that we can count that have survived. And yet, I cannot but think of a certain passage that is surely familiar to most of you, a passage by Don Giussani from the religious sense, in which, if I'm not mistaken, in the section of morality, he speaks of the necessity to fix distance and sight in order to understand the object that we have in front of us. And he compares this to another position, the positivistic position. And he shows the difference between someone who goes closer to a painting and they only see stains on the wall, and when instead they take a step back and they understand the connection between all those colors. In the first case, they are ugly and insignificant and incomprehensible. Why was it so interesting for us to go back to these classics as lawyers and jurists with our questions in our hands? These classics have within them that which we could call the tragic distance. In other words, the ability to speak about human problems, taking the contingency and the superficial elements from them to enable the most essential parts with a energy of reiteration. So the stories are the same, but they are continuously repeated, and they give something new every time. I would not like to make banal parallelisms. Who is Oedipus today? Who is Antigone today? But I urge you to keep your questions alive that are very specific to our time, and to have them as you read these texts. With this tragic distance, this is the first reason that we were so interested to conduct this study. The second has to do with another point of Don Giussani, which is, it is best to not start with the specific solution for a problem, but to begin starting from the point of view of the subject, the person at the center. The tragedy was staged in front of the people of Athens, precisely in order to help the people to reflect on the issues that it evoked. These reflections were supposed to touch the deepest structure of the human eye. These are the two reasons. So the first, the tragic distance, and the putting in the center of the problem the human person, are the two reasons for which these texts continue to speak to us today in such a strong way. Having said this, I would like to introduce the story of Oedipus. We have already seen a brief video, and I will. So the beginning of the play starts in Thebes. Thebes is in a moment of serious crisis, which is quite different, which is similar to the situation in Athens. There is a pest that is assailing it, a plague, and the citizens ask the king to help them to be freed from this plague. This is a king that is very esteemed. He is very strong and has great authority, because Oedipus previously had freed the city from the Sphinx, which had impeded the political life of the city to thrive. So he resolves the enigma of the Sphinx, and for this he becomes the king. And with this memory, with this strength as a hero in the memory of the people, he tries to solve the problem of the plague. What does he do? He sends a messenger to the oracle, the prophet, and he asks how to resolve the problem. The prophet says that he must look for the murderer of Laius, who used to be the old king of Thebes. How was this possible? No one had thought about figuring out the murderer of this old king. So the tragedy begins almost like a murder, a mystery. In the video, we saw Tiresias, the prophet, who Oedipus tries to put all the pieces together. slowly but surely, he begins to realize the truth that lies behind all these pieces. The truth is tragic because the king, who is the lawyer, the lawmaker, he realizes that he himself is the person who is to blame for this plague. All of these clues bring this fact to emerge. And how had he killed Laius without even realizing that he had killed him? How is this possible? So, and as a result of this, he will blind himself and he will exile himself from the city. He was not born in Thebes, Oedipus. He was born and grew up in the city of Corinth. During a banquet, a drunken man accuses him of being a bastard, which was a huge offense. "You are not the child of your parents," he said. And so he goes to the prophet. Oedipus goes to the prophet and asks for an explanation. "Who are my parents?" And the prophet responds, "You will kill your father, and you will marry your mother." In front of this kind of a prophecy, this tragic prophecy, Oedipus runs away because he wants to avoid committing those two terrible crimes. This is what brings him to Thebes. On a crossroads, on his way to Thebes, he will encounter a chariot, and we can imagine what he was feeling like at that time. He was nervous. He was completely out of control. He had a small fight with this man in this chariot, and he kills him. And he continues then his road towards Thebes. But he never could have imagined that this man was actually his father. He arrives into Thebes. He solves the mystery of the Sphinx. They make him king as a gesture of gratitude for what he had done for the city. And he marries Jocasta. And this prophecy, from which he tried to avoid, insofar as he was a just man, he wanted to avoid this in every possible way. Paradoxically, he finds himself exactly in that situation. We could finish this summary with a small reflection, and I will then give the floor to Luciano. One of the many reflections we could have on this story is a reflection on the possible origins of injustice and of evil. Because Oedipus is not the typical evil character. The murder of his father and the wedding with his mother were neither random. Sometimes we can find ourselves angry for something unjust that happens to us. A disease, a job we may lose, something, anything that could go in a wrong way for us. He is not, therefore, in this way, a typical evil person. He does not have within himself a total absence of a moral compass. He doesn't want to marry his wife. He doesn't even marry his mother to obtain anything. He's not the typical king who is corrupt and does anything to obtain as much power as he can. Oedipus is completely different. He is the only reason for the evil, for the plague that is happening in Thebes, which is decimating the city. But he is the reason for this evil completely involuntarily. Is this completely random? Not completely. There is an important dialogue between Oedipus and the prophet when they are speaking about the dialogue between the drunken man and Oedipus. He recalls this episode to the prophet and he asks him, "Who are my parents?" The answer to this question is, "You will kill your father and marry your mother." When Oedipus runs away from this horror that is prophesied to him, he is missing a crucial piece of information. He does not have the answer to the question that he posed to the prophet. He runs away from evil, but he doesn't actually know who his parents are. For this reason, is this why you say that the tragedy is for a fault in misinformation? There is this destiny that is held, which he has to go against. Of course, this is the question of a piece of knowledge which is missing is obviously a crucial point here. I have spoken to experts in Greek civilization. There is a difference between the concept of adikema, the pure fatality, and amartema, which is the weakness of man, the possibility of making a mistake. In other words, Oedipus tries to avoid evil, but within his human structure, there is something which is structural. In other words, his human structure has within it something which is fallible. The desire to do good, which ignores this human fallibility, the fact that the human structure is fallible, tends towards the opposite of justice. In a book by Romano Guardini, commenting Destiny and Justice, he says, words have an elevated sound, but also a tragic sound. word language has been praised. But how many disgraces can we link language? Can language be linked to? Many. Man's attempt to go towards justice, to behave in a just way, puts this move towards justice, if it is not carried out taking account of this fallibility of the human structure, can actually bring to the opposite of justice. It can become the opposite of the original intent. So this story is like we could call it the praise of imperfect justice. The studies that a lawyer carries out in the Italian tradition have the virtue of prudence. And in this Italian tradition, the virtue of prudence is not the virtue of he who does not have courage, who is undecided. The virtue of prudence, and this is important for me, this concept is important for me, it has to do with the plurality of gazes, of points of view. Like Oedipus, we could also say, Oedipus, you see but you don't have visibility. I like also to link this to an image in which we see a man, a wise man who looks towards a three-faced man, the oldest man who looks towards the present, the mature man who looks into the present, and the young man who looks into the future. So prudence, what does this mean? One point of view, one gaze is insufficient. You might have the single gaze of the old man who is mature, who is wise, like Oedipus, who is unable to compensate for the fallibility of his human structure. We could also cite the Coelet. We should not try to be too just, excessively just, but we should be aware of our own limits and our own fallibility.
I'd like to give the floor to Professor Violante now. I don't know whether he'd like to add anything, but let's talk about Antigone. I chose that trailer because even though it's a quite rough trailer, it depicts that time, and somehow it's a take on Antigone. Nowadays, we constantly talk about Antigone. So many famous people that find themselves in difficult situations are called Antigone. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think about this? Because I think that your take is quite a provocation. You have an an interesting stance. What time is it? I think we're a bit late. Well, we started late, so we have time. Well, I was told that we had to finish at 8. If anyone would like to tell us the time and what time we should finish. But anyways, as Marta said, we are not two experts of Greek literature. We were called by the Mulino of the city of Bologna, and Marta had written something about Oedipus and I had written something about Antigone. We had already talked about this. They asked us to write our speeches and our reflections down. So for some time we worked together and we wrote this book. As for Antigone, Antigone is a later work than Oedipus. So we have two sons in Thebes, Eteocles and Polynices, but there is just one throne. They are Oedipus's sons. So they decide to rule 1 year each. Eteocles is the older son, so he decides to start, and then it's time for Polynices to start. But when it's time for Polynices to rule the city, Eteocles says, "No, I will continue and rule the city." So they fight. And Polynices leaves Thebes. He creates an army and decides to attack Thebes, attack his own city. The two armies fight, the two brothers fight, and they both die. At that point, there was just one man left in the family, Creon, who becomes king, and he makes a new law. So similar to what Marta has said. Even in this case, we have a new bill. According to this bill, the murderer, Polynices, could not be buried. Creon says that his body had to be abandoned because he had attacked the city, whereas Eteocles had defended Thebes. Nonetheless, Antigone, the sister, decides to bury her brother anyways, going against her uncle's will. So the whole myth, starting from Hegel, Goethe, then in Romanticism, and then once again discussed during the Second World War, it's the myth of a bad king, bad power. And on the other hand, a young, strong woman, a young opposer, with a very strong conscience. So all the episodes are about this, the episodes in the play. But this is just the myth. The tragedy is actually something else, because as it's already been said, the Greek tragedies had to display the issues of society. They were public representations of society, so that the whole society could see these problems and these issues. This play was shown the first time in 450 before Christ, and it was about modernization and family. So for the first time, we see we actually see the woman ruling in the family and the man ruling in society. So there's a clash here, because Creon makes the law for the society and for his city, whereas Antigone represents the laws of the family. So Antigone asks for the gods of Hades to intervene. And Creon disagrees with her because he believes that laws should be respected. So I believe that we should think about this character of Creon because, on the one hand, he doesn't want to go against Antigone, but he has to because this is the law. So there's this opposition, Creon and Antigone. They both have principles and they cannot meet in the middle. They cannot find a compromise. Ratzinger wrote that compromise is the soul of politics, negotiation. This is politics. But they are not able to compromise, to find a compromise. So, in the tragedy of Antigone, there is an interesting passage which even Goethe commented. Antigone, talking to the body of her dead brother, Polynices, says, "If I had another brother, I wouldn't bury you, because I could be with another brother. If I had a husband, I wouldn't bury you, but I don't want to get married. If I had a son, I wouldn't do this, but I'm not going to get married, and so I'm not going to have any sons. So this is why I do this." So Antigone is not a typical heroine. She has her doubts, she has her questions, she's a human being. So this is why Antigone is not our typical hero. What do I mean by this? That a lawmaker has to face difficult decisions. When there's conflict, then we have to be able to find a compromise and to find a solution. Creon creates a conflict that he is not able to solve, as well as Polynices. He creates a conflict he's not able to solve. So in politics, the most important thing is not start a conflict that we're not able to finish, to solve. We have to be careful, otherwise we risk, we may actually become the victim. So we should think about the difficulties the government has to face, but we also should pay attention to the people of Thebes, which at the beginning agrees with Creon. But then, as time goes by, the people changes their mind and agrees with Antigone. Usually, people make decisions by themselves. Whereas in this case, we have many people switching sides. So Greek tragedies represent the tragedy of life. We have tragedy when there's no God. We have even talked about other two tragedies that delve into this issue. Marta has already talked about this. We have discussed other tragedies, but in this case, we don't have any gods. There's another Greek tragedy about Orestes. He flees because he kills his mother, and this tragedy represents justice winning against vengeance. In other tragedy, a god intervenes and makes justice triumph. So every time there's a god, and this is why Antigone is different, because here we don't have any gods. But I would like to ask you something. So you give us another take on Antigone, quite a provocative one. But I have a question. Why instead do we create parallelisms between contemporary female figures and Antigone? Why do you think our society still uses this myth without actually seeing these issues you have just stressed and underlined? Well, I'd say because we need heroes. This is an attempt to make heroes out of normal people, using a myth to see someone as a hero. This is the issue of the meaning of life. If we're not able to find the meaning of life within ourselves, then we look for it outside ourselves. And heroes are reassuring. They give us a point of view on reality when we don't have any. So this is a way to simplify contradictions and to avoid contradictions. Well, Moro was one of my teachers in Bari University, and he taught me something very important. He said we need to make a distinction between making something simple and making something banal, because those who simplify take out something that's not necessary. Instead, if you make something banal, that you take out something that is necessary. Simplification is hard, is a difficult task, and you need to know a lot in order to properly simplify. Instead, something banal is something superfluous. Heroes give us the possibility to find the meaning of life without asking too many questions. Heroes are complex characters, and by this I don't mean contradictory characters, just complex. And they help us find a meaning of life when we cannot find any. So to conclude, we're talking about the greatest issue of all, fighting against nihilism, fighting against the idea that life has no meaning. So heroes help us fight against nihilism, but this is not enough to find the meaning of life.
C'è un elemento.
There's a recurring element in both tragedies and in both of your takes on these tragedies. The good of the city. The reasons why things happen, for example, Oedipus comes to save the city, or the reason why Creon does not give up on the idea to not to bury Polynices. He thinks this is for the good of the city. So what do these two tragedies tell us about the current times and about the ability to understand what's the good of our society. I don't know whether this has been planned or not, but there's Mr. Weiler here who's translating our book into English. And maybe he wants to add something, I don't know. But as for something done for the city's good, we could say many things, but I will just talk about one. The issue of justice and injustice is incredibly personal. We all know what injustice feels like. That feeling of anger inside you when you see something unjust or when you go through an unjust situation. But it is actually never a completely personal issue. It is also a political issue. Luciano was talking about the tragedy of the Humanists. Which starts with the poison spreading in front of the chain of evil. Now I will not go into details, but there's continuous tragedies happening to this family. People killing each other, people getting arrested. It's a chain of evil, of tragic events. And evil seems endless. As Calamandrei says, injustice poisons even in very small doses. It's that poisonous feeling that we feel, which usually leads to vengeance and revenge. Nowadays, like 500 years ago. So this chain of tragedies is represented by this chain that the goddesses hold. The Erinyes hold. But what's the ending of this tragedy? After Orestes' trial, he is forgiven thanks to Athena after killing his own mother. Nonetheless, the tragedy is not over. Athena had created the trial to fight against the idea of justice as revenge. Then she goes to the Erinyes, who were furious because they actually lose the trial. They are quite mean, and especially after the trial, they are ready to destroy the city. But after talking to them, Athena convinces them to become part of the city, and from the goddesses of vengeance, they actually becomes other goddesses that bring something good, the Eumenides. So why am I saying this? First of all, because there's a family going through a very hard time. Their tragedies almost lead to the destruction of the city, and Oedipus kills his own father and marries his own mother. These are private crimes that nonetheless influence the whole city. But Athena thinks her work is done not after Orestes' trial, but after finding a way to transform vengeance into something good, finding a place in the city for these old goddesses of vengeance. So there's a possible solution here, because Athena shows us that a good government is possible when even the losing side is included. Mariella Carlotti has talked about justice and the good government here. When justice is a poorly dressed woman, then that's the sign of a bad government. A good government is always balanced, is always a beautiful woman. Every conflict has a public side, no matter the size of the conflict. And on that side depends the destiny of a city. Violante, what do you think about the good of the city? I was struck by something, because Oedipus didn't know who his father was. He didn't know that Jocasta was his mother. And Creon tries and apply a law without any discriminations. But there's another category in these tragedies, the one of impurity, which means that someone is not the culprit, but is just impure. Someone is not guilty. For example, let's say there's a country where one of us, we live in a country where if we meet someone who's ill or in a dangerous situation, has to inform the police, otherwise we commit the crime of omission. If someone is sinking in the sea, we have to ask him where he's from, because if that person is not from our country, then we are actually committing a crime if we save him and take him with us. So can you please tell me why in countries like Germany, Italy, and so on, if I'm a gypsy or if I show my religion with any kinds of symbols, can you please tell me why I'm not regarded as valuable as someone who's not wearing anything or is just white? So these people are regarded as impure, black people, gypsies, and so on. So someone may attack you, and authorities may even say that that was right, just because you belong to one of these categories. And this is the problem of modern cities, because when discrimination starts, you never know how it ends. Each one of us can be a minority. Women, children, old people, any kinds of religions. So I believe that we do not pay attention to this enough. There's an interesting picture called The Fall of Icarus. And there are farmers who are working in the field, and in one corner there's just a leg. Do you know what this picture is called? It's called the Fall of Icarus, because no one notices that something incredible is happening. A man who is able to fly and who goes towards the sun then falls, and no one sees it because everyone is carrying out their work, is looking at their own feet. So I believe that nowadays we should look up and look around at what's happening. So Professor Weiler gives up his question. I'd like to add another question, though. The closing question.
I will choose my last question. In the final chapter of this small book, you touch on a very controversial point, and which is also, I will give you a couple of, I will quote something directly. They speak about a penal law that has brought to a punishment which is unjust. They speak about a person that should be considered as much more valuable than its own actions, than their own actions. A lot of these things seem praisable and full of reasonableness. But how can we change direction and begin to interpret these points in the context of Italy today? There is a government that continues to lose consensus on these points. And the most lucid and intelligent minds of our country it's almost as if we are waiting for better times. I would like to ask you, as lawyers, as jurists, how can we correct this common mentality of anger and resentment, which opposes itself, is just opposed to the concept of justice? I think that what the Constitutional Court is doing today will be visible at 5 p.m. tomorrow. The Constitutional Court visited a good number of prisons here in Italy, and I would prefer not to speak much more on this because I've spoken more than Violante, and the answer to the question is in what you will see tomorrow at 5 p.m. There's an extraordinary thing. There is an Arab prisoner woman who testifies to how it is quite different to be a woman in prison compared to being a man in prison. Because if you are a woman, your mother, your family are less likely to come and visit you. Because the loneliness of a woman is quite different to the loneliness of a man in a prison. And regarding the question that you posed, Italy is not only what we read in the papers. I am not Catholic, I am a believer, but we have you. Italy also has you. There is also another Italy. And this Italy should have the courage to emerge. We also have virtue in Italy. Otherwise, Italy would never have come out of all the crises that it has been inflicted with, terrorism, for one. And Falcone, for example, the mafia. What would another country have done? We are still standing, we are still here. What would other countries have done? We have to have the awareness of our own dignity. We have to claim back our own dignity. And this anger, I understand this position. We should not have a representation of this anger, but a representation which moves. Politics must persuade, not pursue. I would encourage a different type of behavior, and this is what is required on behalf of everyone. Democracy does not exist if there is no democratic behavior. And this must begin from the governing classes. It is difficult, if the governing class is not democratic, to ask the people to be democratic. So I encourage the people who can to let what good there is in this country to emerge. Of course, the vulgarity, the anger, the injustice we have, that is there, but that's not the only thing that is there. So us journalists also must review our conscience from time to time. We are like Aeschylus in this. In a way, I understand and I take on board the faults of my own society. I think this is a read that could help a lot of us. And I think it would encourage us to also go back to the tragedy and read them for ourselves. I encourage you to do this summer. Thank you, Luciano Violante and Marta Cartabia. And as Gaber used to say, we should think that thoughts are present, are alive.